Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I wanted to share my list of my favorite first-time fiction reads in 2022. So these are all novels or proto-novels that I absolutely enjoyed reading last year. Each of these stayed with me in some way, whether it was an idea around a particular individual, an entire culture, the human imagination, the power of language itself. Each of these books resonated in some way with my mind or with my heart. So I want to share this list with you. I have a full video on all but one of these books, so I'll link those in the description box below. And I've enjoyed seeing top 10, top 5 lists. I'm just going to sort of break mine up into 3 tiers. So we're going to start with books that are honorable mentions, books that weren't quite at the top for me, but each of them has some merit, some kernel that I really gravitated towards, and I could see myself rereading these in the future. So we'll kick off with Calacane from Karen Boyd. This is a dystopic novel. It is very powerful. It sort of slots in between some of the famous ones like We by Evgeny Zamyatin, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and then it precedes 1984 by George Orwell, and yet gets at so many of those ideas in a very personal way with Karen Boyd, with some of the sort of oppression and persecution she was facing there in the latter 1930s and the rise of Nazism across the sea there in Germany. She was in Sweden, but was very affected by all of this. So this was a very strong book. If you've never read it and you're into science fiction or into sort of socio-political fiction, this is one I would definitely recommend checking out. Up next, Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry. This is a tough one. There are aspects of this that I really didn't like. There are aspects of it that I thought were really interesting. There's a way in which I feel like sort of criticism around the book has centered far too much on Lowry's own personal alcoholism and how that's reflected in one of the characters in the book. And yet there are 4 major characters in the book, and I think the other 3 each have so much to add to the novel itself, to the ideas that Lowry was trying to express. Again, sort of set in the same time period as Calacane was being written, and very much of that time, of the fears around what was happening with the rise of fascism in Europe, but how that was affecting other parts of the world. And so this was a strong book, but as I said, there were some elements of it that I just really didn't like, and I'd like to approach it with my own perspective even more than I did the first time I read it. Up next is not this book by Thomas Bernhard, because I want to talk about Concrete, and this is Gargoyles. But I got Concrete from the library, really enjoyed that. I definitely enjoyed it more than Gargoyles. It was a later work, and Bernhard has this ability to craft these like deeply perceptive monologues that just unleash and bear out a single mind, psyche, soul, all of it just laid out. What I particularly enjoyed in Concrete was the ending with the sort of the revelation of how other people will desire human interactions, human relationships, trust, love, just some type of connection. And so I thought that was very powerful. I'll be looking forward to reading more of Bernhard's work in the future. And then finally, the one book that I haven't done a video on, and I'll be doing that in the near future, but that would be Chess Story by Stefan Zweig. Again, another work coming directly out of the rise of fascism in Europe at that time period. It focuses in a very, it's psychologically subtle while being very open about the horror that a character within this book has faced sort of in his imprisonment in Nazi Germany, and the way that chess is used as this metaphor for sort of the ideas around culture and tradition, and how all that can be wiped away so quickly, and the very real horrors and fears that individuals face. But I thought this is by far the best work I've read from Zweig, and something that has me like curious to read more of his like short fiction now. All right, into the next group, and these are books now that I really loved. They're not quite at the very top. These aren't like gold medal books for me, but wow, each of these was fantastic. If you've never read any of them, please, see if you can find them at your library, see if a friend has them. Maybe you have these on your shelves. Pull them down this year, open them up, take a look at these books. I'm going to start with 2 that I don't have in person. One of those was The Fisherman by John Langan. Each of these I got from the library. That's a great cosmic horror book. There's a lot of intertextuality with Moby Dick specifically, but with various other ideas around horror and cosmic horror, the very real grief that Langan tries to express within the novel, and that I think he very effectively expresses around the grief of losing a loved one, and then how that is elevated across a cosmic horror in a very real, authentic, like naturalistic way. Thought it was incredibly effective. The other one is The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk. That is a long, almost 1,000 page novel. It is a panoramic view of sort of the 18th century in Poland and Lithuania. It is fantastic. It is fantastically detailed and exhaustive at times. And I think it's a book that feels exhausting for some readers, many readers perhaps. I thought I was mesmerized. I couldn't, I had to dip in and out of it, but it was a book that I could continually return to. It just exerted such deep, like intellectual weight and heft to it that I just kept drawing myself like deeper into it, deeper into the world, reading secondary sources around it, reading primary sources that have been translated from that time. I just absolutely loved it. And it's one that I know I will return to in the future. In a few years, I want to come back to that work, having read the full Zohar, which I'll have to do at my library because it's a reference book. But that's one I will definitely return to. Now, from that, some books that I can hold up for you. And these are just sort of in the Man Who Lived Underground by Richard Wright. This is a dynamite book. It is a sort of apocalyptic novel. It feels very close to what Ralph Ellison did in Invisible Man, but it has the energy and the vitality that was always something Wright could do in his writing. It feels very, very much the work in between Native Son and Ellison's Invisible Man. It's exploring so many of the themes from Invisible Man that Ellison would later explore, but it's doing it with that perspective, that very like dark, brutal, cynical perspective that was very much Richard Wright's like own perspective. It is a work that was so incendiary it could not be published in its complete form until just very recently. So this is one that, again, it's probably at your library. Take a look out for it. The Adventures of China Iron by Gabriela Cabezon Camara. This book was a riot. It's a feminist Western. It's a revisionist Western. It's a romance. It is a queer retelling of Argentina's gaucho epic, Martín Fierro. It is a book about the way in which a nation forms its identity, its cultural identity, its political identity, the way that people will lie to help form that national or cultural or political identity. It is so many things. I absolutely loved it. There was so much energy to this book. There was so much verve. And there was just so much fun between these pages. So this is one, again, it was recently published by Charco Press, translated from Spanish. So this is one that I really loved. And then The Radiance of the King by Kamara Lay. I read this almost a year ago at this point now. But I was, again, mesmerized. There's something that's very Kafkaesque about this book. We have a European who believes that sort of he's entitled to just get what he wants, get an audience with the king and then fix these various things and he can basically get out of this African land that he's in. And he goes deeper and deeper into sort of the heartland of this African nation to find this king. The language is very sensory. It is again, I mentioned Kafkaesque. There's an element of real dread and despair and of feeling the other, feeling outside of the society. It's a book that kind of turns so many ideas around how, so many colonial ideas around how Africans needed to assimilate into European culture, turns all of those on its head. It's sort of a response even to works like Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. But I was, again, entranced by this book. And the ending was almost this like apotheosis type ending. So it was a great climax in this book. And now finally for the books that I absolutely loved, each of these sort of is on my list of like, I wish I could give them 6 out of 5 stars. They're superb masterpieces crafted in a special way. The first one is one that I've lent out to a friend. It's Sula by Toni Morrison. It was her second novel. It is such a powerful book. I think anyone who's read it, anyone who's read many of Toni Morrison's novels understands what I mean by that. But it is a book about female friendship. It is a book about sort of finding different ways to have success and the ways in which societies or communities try to define success for individuals, or even friends try to define success for each other, and trying to define that for oneself, I think, in a very real way. It is a very emotional book. It is horrifying at times, as so many of Morrison's works are, in the way that they reflect the horrors that we encounter in life, and yet it is also a very vital, living book. It's brimming with feeling, in the way that life is. And so that was a book that I just absolutely loved. But moving forward now to these last few that I can hold up. the opening book in the Memory of Fire trilogy by Eduardo Galeano, Genesis. I'll be looking forward to reading Faces and Masks, and then Century of the Wind, hopefully this year. I'm still looking for a copy of Faces and Masks, but this book was dynamite. It's not quite a novel, it's not quite an essay, it's not quite a sort of compendium of primary sources. It's all of those things fused together in this sort of semi-fictional novelistic form that is incredible. Real life historical persons or personages occur across these pages. There are quotations from primary sources, and yet throughout it, Galeano is drawing this massive macrocosmic view of Central and South America, primarily with some setting passages set in the Caribbean or in North America, and then telescoping down into this microcosmic view of actual individuals. So what is happening as the Spanish, the Portuguese, later on the English and French arrive and completely turn these continents over and just ransack and destroy whole cultures. Who were those cultures before that arrival? Who were the individuals at the heart of so many of these stories? So many names are suddenly made flesh on these pages. This is one of the finest books I've ever read. Honestly, Memory of Fire should be mentioned as one of the great novels of the 20th century, just based on the first third of it that I've read. There is so much power to this book, and I cannot believe I had never heard of it until 2022. Up next, The Sun Hath Looked Upon Me by Calixta Biala. I keep trying to press this book on BookTube. Folks aren't picking it up, but I wish more folks would take the time to read this book. It is very short. It is only 120 pages, and yet it is one of the single finest, single rawest novels that I've ever read. It's set in the second half of the 20th century in Cameroon. Biala had grown up in Cameroon, but later was educated in France, sort of for her like post-secondary education. She has an incredible voice. I'm looking forward to reading another of her works later on this year. And again, like when I think of this book, I think of how much attention is paid to a novel like Under the Volcano by Lowry, and I think this book is just so far superior to it. And it's such a unique and important perspective and an important voice from Biala. And yet I've never found anyone else who's read this book. So I'm hoping someone else will pick it up this year and read it. And then finally, the single like proto-novel that I keep returning to sort of mentally the most across this year is Vicinder by Fakhreddin Gorgani. This translation from the original Persian is by Dick Davis. This is a novel as a poem, and it is absolutely extraordinary. It is sort of the original germ of what became the romance of Tristan, and later like other Arthurian romances in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. It predates those works, and wow, the language here is just full on ornate. It's probably one of the finest examples of that ability and that tendency perhaps among the Persian versions of the Alexander Romance to take language and want to explore with it, want to have fun with it, in a way that we praise so many 20th century and 21st century writers for trying to do. Writers like James Joyce are elevated, and Virginia Woolf in a certain way are elevated because of what we think they did with language, Vladimir Nabokov. And yet Gorgani was doing that along with numerous other Persians close to a millennium before any of those writers picked up a pen. So if that's the type of book you like to explore, please check out Vicinder. It is also an incredible romance. It is a window into Parthian culture, into Persian culture, into pre- and post-Islamic culture, Persian culture. There are so many just incredible images, particularly that Gorgani, crafted and wove into his narrative, and that Dick Davis is able to bring out in an English poetic translation. So again, this is one I cannot recommend highly enough. So these were my favorite fiction first-time reads in 2022. I'll make another video, hopefully this week, next week, that focuses on nonfiction rereads and one or two plays that I read last year. But let me know what your favorites were, if they were any of these, if we shared any common favorites, if you've read any of these and also really enjoyed them, or any other works from these writers that you really loved. And again, I hope everybody's doing well. Thank you.